A $24,000 transmission failure, that's what the dealership claimed this big John Deere needed. But they underestimated an honest farmer who refused to be scammed. What he found inside the oil tank didn't just save his tractor for $42, it exposed a massive corporate secret that shocked the entire farming community. Here is the full story. The wind coming off the Platte River on the 9th of February did not care about coat zippers or leather gloves. It cut straight through heavy canvas and settled deep into a man's bones. Out in the gravel yard of the equipment sale just north of Kearney, Nebraska, 200 farmers stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing gray air. Their collars were turned up against the sleet, their hats pulled low, watching diesel smoke drift across the rows of iron. 54-year-old Art Vance stood near the rear of the crowd with his hands shoved deep into his denim jacket pockets. He was not looking at the late-model combines or the high-horsepower row crop rigs lined up near the main office. His eyes were locked on a 1999 John Deere 8400 sitting near the edge of the fence line. The paint on the hood was deep, rich, and unblemished by sun exposure. The cab glass was clear, without a single crack. The rear duals still carried sharp edges on the tread, showing minimal field wear. By all visual measures, it was a prime machine, built in an era when heavy steel and mechanical integrity mattered more than plastic trim and computer sensors. But as the yard tractor towed the green machine onto the auction ramp, the fast-talking auctioneer adjusted his microphone and raised his voice to make sure every buyer heard his words clearly. He declared that the tractor had 8,000 series hours on the engine, but the transmission was completely non-responsive. It was being sold under strict dealer consignment, strictly as is, with zero warranty, zero guarantee, and no recourse for the buyer. Standing on the wooden platform just below the auction box was Derek Paulson, the service supervisor for Midwest Ag and Power. He wore a crisp corporate jacket with the dealership logo stitched across the chest. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk on his face as he surveyed the crowd. He knew what the diagnostic sheets back at his shop said, and he knew no sensible farmer in Custer County would touch a locked-up power shift without deep pockets. The auctioneer started the chant, calling for $20,000. The crowd remained dead quiet. Nobody raised a hand. The call dropped to $15,000, then $12,000. Still, nothing moved except the cold wind blowing across the dirt. When the chant hit $8,000, Art Vance raised his right index finger just high enough for the ringman to catch it. Derek Paulson's eyes snapped toward the back of the yard, his mouth twisting in disbelief as the gavel came down. Art had just bought $40,000 worth of green iron for less than the price of a used pickup truck, and the long road ahead was just beginning. Art walked toward the cashier's trailer with the receipt folded in his palm, the paper stiff from the cold. Before he could reach the door, a heavy boot stepped into the gravel directly in his path. Derek Paulson stood there with his hands shoved into his corporate jacket, the Midwest Ag and Power emblem sitting bold over his chest. A sharp, mocking grin tugged at the corner of his mouth as he looked from Art to the green machine sitting motionless on the ramp. Paulson asked Art if he actually knew what he had just bought, his voice dripping with condescension. Art stopped, adjusting his hat against the rising wind, and replied calmly that he had bought a clean 1999 John Deere 8400. Paulson let out a dry, breathy laugh that turned into a cloud of steam in the freezing air. He informed Art that the tractor was a paperweight, explaining that his shop had run a full electronic diagnostic on that power shift transmission just 3 weeks prior. He claimed the internal planetary sets were scorched, the control valve was shot, and the entire hydraulic circuit was contaminated beyond salvage. He boasted that they had quoted the previous owner $24,000 for a complete factory remanufactured swap, which was why the old man dumped it at auction instead of writing the check. Art looked past the service supervisor, taking in the clean lines of the sheet metal and the dry frame rails. He remarked simply that $24,000 sounded like a price generated by a computer screen rather than a man holding a wrench. Paulson's grin vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened stare. He told Art that independent farmers could not handle these high-pressure hydraulic control systems in a dirt floor shed. He warned Art that when he got tired of staring at 14 tons of useless iron, he could haul it straight to Midwest Ag's service bay, where they would gladly do the work at full shop rates. Art did not argue. He walked past Paulson, paid the clerk, and backed his heavy gooseneck trailer up to the loading ramp. It took 2 winches and an hour of dangerous work in the freezing sleet to drag the dead John Deere onto the deck. As Art pulled out of the auction yard and headed north toward his farm outside Ansley, the weight behind his truck felt immense. He had gambled $14,000 of his winter savings on a machine a major dealership called Unfixable. If Paulson was right, Art had just bought the most expensive lawn ornament in Custer County. The diesel engine of Art's truck hummed a steady rhythm as he navigated the narrow 2-lane highway heading north into Custer County. In the side mirror, the tall green hood of the John Deere 8400 rode heavy against the gray sky. For Art, the quiet cab of a truck had always been a place for remembering, and looking back at that silent tractor brought his father's voice clear into his mind. Art had come of age on this same soil during the brutal farm crisis of the mid-1980s. Back then, survival was not measured by crop yields alone, but by how long a man could keep an aging machine running when there was no money in the bank account to buy new parts. His father, Thomas Vance, had run a modest 1,100-acre operation with a pair of sound, well-worn tractors, and a shop that smelled of gear lube, coal smoke, and arc welding. Thomas taught his son that a broken machine was not a failure, it was simply a puzzle waiting for a careful eye and a steady hand. When a main shaft sheared, or a hydraulic pump gave up during harvest, you did not call a flatbed to haul it to town. You pulled the housing down, measured the tolerances with micrometer calipers, and found a way to fix it yourself, even if it meant turning a custom sleeve on the shop lathe late into the night. That mechanical education was forged out of sheer necessity, built on a foundation of respect for the iron and the men who crafted it. But over the last 2 decades, Art had watched the agricultural world shift beneath his boots. The old independent dealerships that once traded on handshakes and middle-of-the-night emergency parts runs had been swallowed by massive corporate networks. Today, the front desks were staffed by men in polished polo shirts who viewed equipment not as long-term partner tools for honest labor, but as rolling subscriptions designed to be traded in every 3 years. To them, a complex hydraulic valve or a sealed electronic module was an unserviceable black box, something to be discarded and replaced at maximum margin rather than understood and repaired. Art pulled through his farm gate and backed the heavy trailer up to the sliding wooden doors of his main workshop. He killed the truck engine and stepped out into the quiet snow. Standing beneath the high steel trusses of his heated shop, surrounded by decades of accumulated tools and honest grease, Art looked at the silent Deere. He knew the corporate dealership saw only scrap metal and high-dollar shop hours. But Art believed in the integrity of good iron, and he was determined to prove that real craftsmanship still mattered. The high overhead lights of the shop cast a bright white glow across the clean green paint of the John Deere 8400. Outside, the night dropped well below zero, but inside, the air was warm, smelling of kerosene and dry concrete. Art laid out his heavy-duty socket sets, torque wrenches, and clean oil drain pans along the workbench with deliberate care. He did not rush. A man trying to solve a complex mechanical failure had to start with a clear head and an organized workspace. He placed a hydraulic jack under the heavy rear axle, set sturdy safety stands beneath the frame, and slid under the belly of the machine with an inspection lamp. The underside of the tractor was remarkably clean, showing no signs of external casing cracks or catastrophic housing stress. He unbolted the lower drain plugs, holding a glass sample jar beneath the initial stream. What poured out was not the amber, translucent hydraulic fluid specified for a precision power-shift transmission. It was a thick, pitch-black liquid that flowed like cold molasses, carrying a sharp, acrid odor of severely scorched oil that burned the back of Art's throat. Once the system drained completely, Art unbolted the heavy steel bottom pan and lowered it carefully to the floor. He leaned over with his flashlight, expecting to find what the dealership had claimed: shattered planetary gear teeth, metal shavings, or destroyed friction plates. Instead, the steel magnet at the bottom of the sump was nearly spotless, carrying only a minimal dust of normal iron wear. Moving systematically, Art disconnected the main wiring harness and unbolted the principal hydraulic control valve assembly from the side of the transmission case. He carried the heavy aluminum block over to his clean workbench, setting it down under a bright magnifying lamp. As he slid out the delicate internal spool valves and pressure regulation plungers, the real problem revealed itself. Every tiny oil passage, micro-orifice, and shuttle valve was completely plugged with a thick, tar-like sludge. The internal metallic components were not broken or sheared. They were utterly choked. The high-pressure hydraulic fluid had degraded so severely that it turned into a heavy varnish, gluing the precision valves solid and preventing the transmission from building the pressure required to engage a single gear clutch pack. With the main valve body sitting completely disassembled on his workbench, Art turned his attention to the electronic control harness dangling from the side of the transmission housing. Modern power shift systems relied on a network of precise sensors to tell the tractor's central computer exactly how fast the input shaft was spinning and how much hydraulic pressure was building behind each clutch pack. If the computer lost a signal from even one of these critical nodes, it would lock the entire transmission into neutral as a safety measure to prevent internal damage. Art unbolted the primary transmission input speed sensor tucked deep near the front planetary housing. When he pulled the brass unit from its seat, he did not find a failed mechanical housing or a cracked shaft. Instead, the magnetic tip of the sensor was completely coated in a thick, metallic-tinged paste composed of carbonized oil sludge and fine clutch dust. The thick crust had created a thermal blanket around the sensor, insulating it until the delicate internal wiring overheated and shorted out entirely. Art set his multimeter to test electrical continuity across the two copper leads. He touched the red and black probes to the terminal pins. The digital screen remained dead, reading absolute zero. The computer had not seen a transmission signal because the sensor was physically blinded and electrically dead. Art sat back on his workbench stool, holding the small brass component between his grease-stained fingers. The dealership had written a quote for $24,000 to rip out and replace a massive iron transmission. Yet right here in his palm was the single point of electrical failure. He opened his computer and logged into an independent agricultural equipment parts supplier based out of Lincoln. He found the exact original equipment speed sensor listed for $42. He added it to his digital cart, along with a complete transmission filter overhaul kit, new rubber O-rings for the control valve block, and 2 5-gallon buckets of genuine, high-viscosity John Deere high-guard hydraulic fluid, engineered specifically to withstand extreme pressure and heat. When he reached the checkout screen, the total came to $876, including overnight shipping. Art clicked confirm and closed the laptop. The dealer had called this tractor a total loss, but Art knew the truth was coming together on a steel tray under his shop lights. The delivery truck pulled down the snow-covered driveway at noon on Friday, dropping off a heavy cardboard box on the shop steps. Art carried it straight inside, set it on the workbench, and went to work without wasting a single movement. For 2 straight days, he had scrubbed every square inch of the transmission valve body. He had soaked the aluminum casting in solvent, blown out every tiny hydraulic passageway with compressed air, and polished the precision spool valves until they slid smoothly in their bores with zero resistance. Now, with the fresh parts spread out before him, he systematically reassembled the assembly. He installed new high-temp rubber seals, torqued every bolt down to exact factory inch-pound specifications, and bolted the heavy valve block back onto the side of the John Deere's transmission case. Next, he picked up the new $42 speed sensor. He carefully coated its O-ring with fresh hydraulic oil, slid it into its mounting port, and plugged the main wiring harness firmly into place until the plastic tab clicked home. He installed new spin-on filter elements under the frame rail, screwed the heavy steel pan back into place, and poured 10 gallons of fresh, crystal-clear John Deere high-guard fluid down the dipstick tube. Art stepped up into the cab, settled into the air ride seat, and turned the ignition key. The big 8.1-liter turbocharged diesel engine turned over twice and roared to life, filling the shop with a deep, steady mechanical hum. He let the engine idle for 15 minutes, watching the temperature gauges climb steadily into the normal operating range as warm coolant circulated through the block. With his foot resting light on the clutch pedal, Art reached out and pulled the main power shift lever out of park and into first gear forward. He eased his foot off the pedal. There was no grinding, no metallic bang, and no delay. The hydraulic pressure gauge on the corner post display surged into the green zone, and the 14-ton tractor rolled forward smooth as silk across the concrete shop floor. Art opened the heavy wooden shop doors and guided the green machine out into the blinding white snow. He pushed the shift lever forward, running the transmission up through 5th, 8th, 12th, and into 16th gear. The tractor accelerated effortlessly, shifting clean and firm across the frozen ground. Art stopped at the edge of his field, turned the tractor around, and brought it back to a smooth halt. The dealership had written off a prime machine as useless scrap, but sitting in the warm cab under the Nebraska sky, Art knew his hands had just proven them dead wrong. Art backed the John Deere 8400 into the shop and shut down the engine. The quiet that settled over the building was different now. The heavy iron was no longer a 14-ton question mark sitting in the dark. It was a running, working machine. But as Art sat in the operator's seat listening to the exhaust stack tick down as it cooled, one thought kept turning in his mind. A heavy-duty power shift transmission, engineered by John Deere, did not simply break down its fluid into black tar on its own. Not at 8,000 hours. Something had caused that oil to break down, cook off, and coat every valve spool in the housing. Art grabbed a shop vacuum, a fresh bottle of glass cleaner, and a heavy scraper to detail the cab interior. If he was going to put this tractor into his Springfield lineup, he wanted it clean from top to bottom. He pulled the air ride seat adjustment lever, slid the seat all the way back against the rear cab wall, and started cleaning out years of accumulated dirt, old crop tickets, and dried mud from the footwells. When he reached down to pull up the thick rubber floor mat near the foot pedals to clean the steel cab floor underneath, his fingers hit a hard ridge wedged flat against the lower firewall insulation. He pulled back the heavy rubber mat completely. Stuck tightly between the cab floor panel and the steel throttle linkage was a thick, brown manila envelope. It was stained around the edges with dark oil and caked in dry dust, but the metal clasp at the top was still bent shut. Art reached down and pulled the envelope free. He wiped the dirt off the front with his sleeve. Printed across the top corner in black ink was the logo of the previous owner's farm operation, along with a handwritten note that read, 8400 service file. Art unbent the metal clasp and pulled out a stack of folded white papers. They were official computer-printed work orders and service receipts, all bearing the bold blue header of Midwest Ag and Power in Kearney. Art sat down on the tractor step, unfolded the top document, and began reading down the itemized lines dated from May 2004 all the way to November 2006. Art sat under the bright shop light, with the stack of Midwest Ag and Power service receipts spread across his knee. He walked over to his reference shelf, pulled down the thick, black and yellow factory operator's manual for the John Deere 8400, and opened it straight to the lubrication capacities page. The factory manual could not have been clearer. The high-pressure 16-speed power shift system required genuine John Deere high-guard fluid, a specialized high-viscosity formulation engineered specifically to handle extreme mechanical shear, hold its thermal stability under heavy load, and protect delicate electronic solenoid control valves. The manual included an explicit warning printed in bold text: using non-approved or off-spec hydraulic oil would lead to rapid oxidation, thermal breakdown, valve sticking, and total electronic sensor failure. Art turned back to the dealer service receipts. He scanned line by line down the itemized charges from 3 separate 500-hour routine transmission maintenance appointments dated over a 24-month period. On every single invoice, the customer had been charged full price for premium OEM fluid. But right below the billing total, in small internal inventory text, the parts breakdown told a completely different story. The line technician had pulled bulk code 100HYD from the shop's main supply tanks, a cheap, low-grade universal hydraulic oil meant for open-center log splitters and 30-year-old utility tractors. It lacked the advanced anti-foaming agents and heat-stabilizing additives required for a modern, high-pressure power shift transmission. The truth came into razor-sharp focus. Midwest Ag and Power had repeatedly poured low-grade, off-spec fluid into a sophisticated machine, billed the owner top dollar, and watched as the oil oxidized under working temperatures. Over 2 years of heavy field work, the cheap oil broke down into carbonized sludge, cooked the clutch packs, choked the valve body, and blinded the speed sensor. And when the transmission finally locked itself into neutral to prevent catastrophic failure, the dealership did not take responsibility for their own malpractice. Instead, they handed the unsuspecting owner a $24,000 quote for a total transmission replacement. They had created the failure through their own penny-pinching negligence, and then tried to profit from the wreckage. Art folded the receipts carefully, slipped them back into the brown manila envelope, and placed it inside the steel lockbox in his desk. By the last week of April, the frost had finally backed out of the ground in Custer County. The winter air gave way to warm, damp southern winds that dried the dark soil of the Middle Loop River Valley, signaling the start of the spring push. Across the county, diesel engines roared to life at dawn as farm operators hooked up their seed tenders and field cultivators, racing to get their corn crop in the ground during the narrow planting window. Art pulled the John Deere 8400 out of the shop into the early morning light. The 8.1-liter turbocharged engine hummed with a steady, effortless rhythm, and the green paint caught the first rays of sunrise over the trees. Hooked to the tractor's heavy drawbar was Art's 16-row liquid fertilizer planter, a heavy steel rig that demanded consistent ground speed, massive hydraulic flow, and rock-solid low-end pulling power to maintain accurate seed depth across rolling ground. He swung the tractor onto the 2-lane road and headed out to his south 800-acre block. This river-bottom land was heavy, sticky clay ground that would test any machine's transmission under load. As Art turned down the first headland and lowered the heavy implement into the dark soil, he moved the power shift selector forward. The transmission shifted with crisp, immediate precision, building smooth hydraulic pressure without a single millisecond of hesitating slip or thermal drag. All day long, the big green tractor moved back and forth across the fields, laying down straight rows with unwavering reliability. Art monitored the dashboard displays continuously, watching the transmission oil temperature gauge stay locked right in the center of the green zone, even through the heaviest clay draws. The precision control of the power shift allowed him to dial in his exact ground speed down to 1/10 of a mile per hour, ensuring his planting population remained mathematically perfect across every acre. By the time the sun dipped below the western hills and the evening cold returned to the valley, Art had covered over 180 acres without stopping the engine once. He idled the tractor down at the field edge, climbed down from the cab, and laid his hand flat against the warm side of the transmission housing. There was no excessive heat, no smell of burnt oil, and no warning lights flickering on the dash. A machine that a major dealership had condemned to the scrap heap for a hypothetical $24,000 had just completed a flawless 12-hour workday, powered by honest mechanical work and a $42 part. On the second Tuesday of May, Art pulled the John Deere 8400 into the crowded gravel yard of the local grain co-op in Ansley to fill his bulk tender tanks with liquid nitrogen. The line of equipment stretched out to the main road, packed with regional producers taking a quick break while their tenders topped off. As Art swung the big green machine around the main storage silos, a late-model pickup truck kicked up gravel and pulled to a hard stop right beside his front duals. Out stepped Ed Colby, a prominent local operator who farmed 1,800 acres of irrigated corn just 3 miles down the road. Ed ran a fleet of modern, lease-wrapped machinery and sent every piece of equipment straight to Midwest Ag and Power in Kearney for every oil change and service interval. Ed walked around the rear tires, staring up at the clean sheet metal with his brow furrowed in complete disbelief. Ed asked Art directly if that was the same 8400 that had rolled across the auction block back in February with a dead power shift transmission. Art nodded calmly as he stepped down from the cab ladder, setting his foot on the gravel. Ed shook his head, admitting that he had stood right next to Derek Paulson at that sale and heard the service manager claim the machine required a $24,000 total teardown. Ed asked how many thousands of dollars Art had ended up dumping into the shop bill to get it moving again. Art reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the receipt for the input speed sensor, and handed it over. He explained that the transmission had never been mechanically broken. It had simply been choked to death by carbonized sludge because the dealership spent 3 years pouring cheap, low-grade universal hydraulic fluid into a high-pressure power shift system. Art added that the dead transmission was caused by a blinded $42 sensor and $40 worth of clogged valve spools. Ed's face went pale. He stared at the receipt, then looked back at the tractor, processing what Art had just said. Ed admitted that Midwest Ag had performed transmission services on 3 of his own primary field tractors over the last 2 seasons. Art looked his neighbor straight in the eye and suggested that if Ed wanted to know what was actually going into his own transmissions, he might want to check the line item inventory codes on his receipts against the factory manual before his own machines locked up in the middle of harvest. Word travels across farm country like a prairie fire on a dry November afternoon. It does not move through newspapers or radio broadcasts, but over seed counter handshakes, tailgate conversations along dirt roads, and static-filled calls between tractor cabs late at night. By the time Ed Colby left the grain co-op, the story of Art Vance's 8400 had already crossed the Custer County line. That evening, across 5 townships, desk lamps were turned on in farmhouse offices that had sat dark since tax season. Men who spent 12 hours a day in the dirt sat down in front of steel filing cabinets, pulling out blue-topped invoice folders from Midwest Ag and Power. They spread 3 years of service receipts across dining room tables, clearing away dinner plates to compare line items under bright overhead lights. By midnight, the phone on Art's kitchen counter started ringing. The first call came from Carl Bricker, a farmer south of Myrna who ran 2,200 acres of heavy dryland corn. Carl's voice was tense. He had pulled the work orders for his 2 primary row crop tractors, machines that had gone into the Kearney dealership every 500 hours for factory-recommended hydraulic maintenance. Sitting right below the full-price charge for OEM fluid was the exact same internal inventory code Art had found under his floor mat, bulk code 100HYD, Universal Off-Spec Hydraulic Oil. Before Art could finish talking to Carl, 2 more calls came through on call waiting. By the end of the week, 12 major producers in the valley had conducted their own audits. Every single one of them discovered the same pattern. For at least 36 months, Midwest Ag and Power had been billing its customer base premium rates for specialized factory fluid, while pumping low-grade, high-margin universal oil out of their central bulk drums. The realization hit the farming community like a hard frost. These were not minor accounting oversights. They were systematic choices that compromised hundreds of thousands of dollars in heavy machinery. The quiet trust that had existed between rural operators and the regional dealership evaporated overnight. The pride of owning late-model iron turned into an anxious suspicion, and the men who fed the country began gathering their paperwork, preparing to demand an answer from the suits in town. On a hot Friday morning in early June, 5 dusty pickup trucks pulled into the paved parking lot of Midwest Ag and Power in Kearney. The trucks did not park near the customer entrance. They pulled right up to the glass front of the main showroom, blocking the view of the shiny new machinery on display. Out stepped Art Vance, Ed Colby, Carl Bricker, and 2 other senior operators from Custer County. They walked through the double glass doors in silence, their boots thudding heavy on the polished floorboards. Ed Colby carried a thick black binder, crammed with 3 years of itemized dealership service receipts, factory operator manuals, and independent oil analysis reports. They did not speak to the front desk receptionist. They walked straight past the parts counter, down the carpeted hallway, and pushed open the door to the corner office belonging to Gregory Stahl, the principal owner of the dealership network. Derek Paulson, the service supervisor, was standing by the window holding a cup of coffee. His face drained of color as the 5 men crowded into the room. Ed Colby threw the heavy binder onto Stahl's mahogany desk with a loud bang that rattled the coffee cups. He told the owner to open it and take a look at what his service department had been doing to their machinery. Stahl looked from Ed to Art Vance, trying to maintain his corporate composure. He opened the binder and slowly flipped through the pages. He saw the line item inventory codes highlighting the bulk universal hydraulic fluid, the side-by-side factory fluid specifications, and the certified lab reports showing severe oil degradation across 4 different customer fleets. Derek Paulson tried to step in, claiming that universal fluid was industry standard and worked fine in most general applications. But Carl Bricker cut him off mid-sentence, pointing out that his own transmission had failed 8 months after a dealer service because of that exact off-spec oil. Stahl closed the binder slowly. Sweating under his collar, he offered to flush and reservice every tractor in their fleets, with genuine factory fluid completely free of charge, to settle the matter quiet. Art Vance looked Stahl dead in the eye, and said that free oil changes could not restore lost trust or repair damaged iron. Ed Colby grabbed his binder off the desk, turned his back on the owner, and led the group out of the building, leaving the dealership behind for good. The late June dusk had settled over Custer County, bringing a cool prairie breeze that swept through the open double doors of Art's shop. The John Deere 8400 stood inside, parked over the concrete drain pit after a long day of cultivating the North Quarter. Art was wiping down his wrenches at the main workbench when the sound of tires rolling over gravel broke the evening quiet. A beaten-up pickup truck pulled slowly into the yard, its headlights cutting through the twilight. The driver killed the ignition, stepped out, and stood near the doorway, hesitation clear in his posture. He was a man in his late 20s, wearing grease-stained work trousers and a faded navy blue shirt with the embroidered name tag ripped off the chest pocket. Art recognized him immediately. His name was Mark Hendricks, a young line mechanic who had worked at Midwest Ag and Power for 4 years before abruptly vanishing from the shop roster 2 months prior. Mark stepped into the pool of yellow shop light, looking nervously out toward the dirt road before turning to Art. He began by saying he had seen the 8400 working out in the field the past few weeks, adding that he needed to clear his conscience about what had really gone down behind the dealership's closed service bay doors. Mark confessed that using cheap bulk oil wasn't an accident or a simple inventory mistake. He explained that early in 2004, Derek Paulson and upper management had installed a centralized bulk fluid system connected directly to the service bays. They locked away the individual factory-branded drums and issued a strict shop directive. Every machine coming through for a hydraulic or transmission service was to be filled from the central hose, running cheap universal oil. Mark admitted that several line technicians protested, warning management that modern high-pressure power shift systems would destroy the off-spec fluid, cook the clutch packs, and short out the sensors. But Paulson had shut them down cold. The service manager told them point-blank that using low-cost bulk fluid boosted shop margins by 300% on every oil change. And when those transmissions eventually choked out and failed 2 or 3 years down the line, the dealership would pocket another $20,000 on the back end for a full remanufactured replacement swap. Mark looked down at the concrete floor, his hands shaking slightly, as he admitted that he was the technician who had signed off on Art's tractor back in 2005. He said he had followed orders because he had a newborn at home and couldn't afford to get fired, but the guilt had finally driven him to hand in his notice. Art listened in silence, his jaw set tight as the final piece of corporate deceit fell into place. He laid a heavy, work-worn hand on the young mechanic's shoulder, telling him that standing up and speaking the truth took a man who respected the trade. Mark thanked him quietly, climbed back into his truck, and drove off into the Nebraska night, leaving behind the full, undeniable truth of what had happened inside those dealer bays. The quiet rebellion that began at the Ansley Grain Co-op soon became a full-blown reckoning. Armed with the receipts, oil sample lab reports, and Mark Hendricks's written statement, a coalition of 40 local operators bypassed the regional dealership entirely. They sent a formal, notarized demand for investigation straight to the John Deere corporate headquarters in Moline, Illinois. Corporate auditors arrived in Kearney within a fortnight, unannounced and bearing federal subpoenas for 3 years of internal financial records, inventory logs, and fluid purchase orders. The audit was swift and brutal. When corporate representatives matched the bulk fluid purchasing invoices against the thousands of gallons of premium OEM fluid billed to regional farmers, the paper trail revealed a massive, multi-million-dollar service fraud scheme. The consequences were immediate. John Deere revoked Midwest Ag and Power's official franchise rights, pulling the gold and green sign off the building and repossessing their modern inventory. Derek Paulson and Gregory Stahl found themselves stripped of their business, facing severe civil litigation and pending criminal fraud charges. Within 6 months, the once bustling dealership sat empty. A cavernous, concrete husk behind a chain-link fence, overgrown with weeds, and serving as a silent warning to any entity that put quick profit over honest trade. Meanwhile, life on the Middle Loop River Valley moved on with the steady rhythm of the seasons. Local producers took their business to independent, homegrown mechanics who built their reputations on transparency and respect for the land. And out on the South 800 acres, Art Vance's John Deere 8400 continued to pull its weight through every spring planting and autumn harvest. Year after year, season after season, the big green tractor worked the heavy Nebraska clay without missing a single beat. The paint on the hood faded slightly under the high summer sun, and the engine hour meter clicked past 8,000 hours, but the power shift transmission shifted as crisp and true as the day it rolled off the assembly line. It stood as living proof that a machine built with honest American engineering, maintained with integrity, and cared for by a man who knew its worth would outlast any corporate fraud that tried to tear it down. 10 years later, the October air blew crisp and cold across the stubble of the harvested cornfields. Art Vance stood by the open shop doors, watching his 24-year-old daughter, Sarah, wipe the grease off her hands with a shop rag. Beside her sat the John Deere 8400, its high-pressure power-shift transmission, purring with the same deep, uninterrupted rhythm it had carried for a decade. Sarah had grown up in the cab of that machine, riding in the buddy seat as a little girl, while her father taught her how the earth worked. Now, fresh out of the state agriculture program, she was taking over the management of the family's South 800 acres. She had just finished performing the machine's routine, 500-hour hydraulic maintenance, checking every drain plug, replacing the dual filters, and pouring in genuine, certified John Deere fluid she had inspected herself. Art walked over to his work desk, picked up the original brass key to the 8400, and held it out to her. He didn't offer a long, formal speech. He simply looked her in the eye and told her that a tractor wasn't just a piece of iron. It was a farmer's independence. He reminded her that big corporations, shiny dealerships, and smooth-talking managers would always try to convince a working man or woman that they couldn't understand or fix their own equipment, that self-reliance was a thing of the past. Sarah took the key, her fingers wrapping around the worn brass. Art told her that the day a farmer surrenders the right to know how their own tools work is the day they hand over their freedom to someone else's bottom line. The 8400 wasn't just surviving proof of a $42 sensor and an honest repair. It was a daily reminder that independent knowledge and hard-earned self-reliance will outlast any corporate scheme designed to take advantage of working folk. Sarah climbed into the cab, turned the key, and backed the heavy machine out into the golden evening light, heading down the gravel driveway toward the fields. Art stood in the shop doorway, watching the dust settle behind the green machine, knowing the farm was in good hands. Enjoyed this story? If you believe in independent agriculture, taking pride in your own tools, and holding corporate entities accountable, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with your own tractor repair stories or experiences with dealership service bays. We read every single one. Thanks for watching, and keep standing your ground.